Hey, everybody. Welcome to Art Fight Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Nolan. I'm here with Brian Siskin. And this week, we've got our guest who's coming to us live from Virginia. He's just escaped from New York, just like the film. And we're going to talk today with the director of I guess it's, I don't know if it's actually, I was going to say award-winning short film because it's clearly going to win many awards as soon as people see it more. It was supposed to be at South by Southwest this year, right? It's called Lions in the Corner. Welcome our friend Paul Hairston.
Hello. Thank you so much.
So really quick, I'm not even sure how I came across your film, but I came across it on Twitter. I think somebody tweeted about it or something. And I realized, oh, this sounds like the kind of thing that we would be interested in for the podcast. And I tracked you down on Twitter. I tracked your film down. And I wanted to get into this a little bit before we got on the air today, but we didn't have a chance, but it's just fine because that's what we're here to talk about. But your movie was supposed to, was it supposed to debut at South by Southwest this year?
No, interestingly, it wasn't supposed to debut there. I was actually really surprised. It had an online premiere back in August, so almost a year ago. It got like a Vimeo staff pick, and it sort of stayed that way for a while. Which is,
I didn't know. Yeah, I didn't know about any of this like online happenings.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great, Vimeo is a really great place to sort of. I just felt like I needed to get something out there. It had been a while since I had released something that, wasn't a commercial or something branded.
Sure.
So I put that out there. I was like, I'm not going to wait for festivals. I'm going to put it out there. But I said, heck, I'll submit it anyway. Festivals are usually pretty resistant to picking up stuff that's already freely available online. So when it got into South by, I learned about that, 4 months later. I was floored and really excited. And, I'd never done the festival run before. Yeah, I mean, it was really sad. I was in Australia when, coronavirus was taken off, like I mentioned. And I remember I was supposed to go there with my dad. He was going to drive down with me, and he was really excited to see a lot of the booths and the programs and also not even just film stuff.
Yeah, the whole thing.
Yeah. And, it was they were saying, we're not going to cancel it. All these people were dropping out. Colbert was supposed to speak. All these people are supposed to come. Jack Dorsey was supposed to come. And, everyone was dropping out. And I was like, all right, well, I guess I'll go. And it'll be this weird little half festival. And I'm not even kidding. I booked an Airbnb when they said, it's not canceled. Don't worry about it. We're still having it. And I felt weird about going. And then even my dad dropped out. He's like, I can't go. I'm sorry. So I was like, all right, so it's just me going. Booked an Airbnb, booked a flight. And the next day, maybe not even 24 hours, maybe 12 hours later, they were 3 or 4 days before the festival, they're like, sorry, we're shutting up the whole thing down. So
right, 1 hour after you could have canceled your ticket or something like that.
Exactly. Pretty infuriating, yeah.
So did you just not go to? You didn't go at all. You didn't just go to Austin in the middle of a pandemic or anything like that.
No, I thought about that. I did miss it. I've been to Austin probably 5 or 6 times, and I have a lot of love for that city, but. For me, it was mainly I'd never done the festival thing before. So I felt sort of unlucky. I mean, obviously, there's nothing we can do about it, but I felt sort of bummed that the first year I sort of, had my foray into that world. Public gatherings are not possible.
Right, totally. I do a lot of critical writing about movies, and I believe that I got an update at some point and correct me if I'm wrong and tell me if your movie was included with this, but at some point I think they put out at least a selection of short movies from the festival and made those available to stream. Does that sound familiar? Was your movie included in that?
Yes, it was. And that right. I have a huge, I say that, South by canceled right before. I think they were doing everything in their power to make the festival happen. I don't want to make it sound
of course. Sure.
Ungrateful at all. I think what they did in response to this unprecedented pandemic is, they reached out to all the feature filmmakers originally, and they told us, they're like, hey, we have this deal for willing participants in the feature lineup that, they're going to have a 10-day online. You don't need to make an account. You can just watch it on Amazon Prime. And then a week later, and not everyone wanted to do it. A lot of people were like, no, I didn't, make this film. So, everyone can watch it for free and sort of ruin my chances at distribution or whatever.
Sure.
So for me, my film was already online. I had already made the rounds. I was like, more exposure. And probably the coolest thing about that, if you're a film buff, you probably have heard of Letterboxd. And that's like, the film social media network or whatever. I've been following that for like 5 or 6 years. And I was like so excited to see that someone had put my film on Letterboxd, and it was like this like publicly accessible forum for reviews. It was both a good and a bad thing. I think the top review right now is good story. Okay, doc.
That's interesting. So it's wild, like when you open it up like that. But I think in a way, one of the things I found very fascinating since this all started, like culturally speaking, it's not that big of a leap to understand why it is this way. But like, for instance, visual art galleries, museums, things like that, they've had a lot of trouble, to me, translating their kind of programming to a digital environment, right? Because the experience of being in an art space is just not something that translates to a flat screen very well, Now, that said, we already, viewing on our screens at home was something movies were already doing. It's just further down the chain of distribution. And so films just kind of started saying, like, except for ones like you're talking about, and big studio, like somebody who's this is the thing I worked on for all this time and all this money, and I really have to wait and get it in a theater and make it available for distribution and sale and that kind of thing, and or some big studios who had big tent pole type films who are just like, we're just going to hold on to it. Disney hasn't released Mulan yet. You know what I mean? And so they're just going to wait, but lots of people and lots of movies, they just said, hey, go for it. Let's just put it out there, put it for pay on a platform, or put it for streaming right now or whatever. So I find the way the film world has reacted to be really interesting, because they've done it very quick. They very quickly made a lot of decisions, and very quickly, I mean, one of the main things people are going to remember about this time was watching movies, strangely enough. Yeah, you know what I mean?
A lot of time at home. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's very interesting. And I think it's really rad that you took advantage of just the opportunities you have with Vimeo. I'm really glad that South by was smart enough to include your movie anyway and say, look, this is really good and really well done and really interesting, and it deserves even more exposure that we could give it. I'm glad that they followed through the way they did and have done all these cool things to get those movies out to the world anyway. And somehow in the combination of all that stuff, it came across my eyes, and I am so glad I took the time to watch that movie, because it is rad. Brian, we haven't given you any room to say anything if you want to jump in here.
Hey, listen, I wasn't sure if that was like a deliberate situation or not. I was just going to sort of let it ride and see what happens.
Just keep talking.
No. Well, I mean, I would love to just get right into the film itself, because I like talking about that, but I also like getting past that. You know what I mean? So,
right.
So maybe like without sort of softballing it too much, we can just do the whole thing where it's like, hey, so tell me about the film. But I'm really interested primarily not just in sort of what it's about, obviously, and people understanding that, but and what it means, but ultimately also very interested in sort of the origin story of the film itself, and then also what perhaps challenges you had and all that. So maybe you can just kind of lay it out in general for us, and then we can sort of
drill down
a little bit.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
There's no wrong answers, really.
Yeah. No, I mean, I could just walk. I could just walk away.
That's right. You could just leave.
Yeah.
That's actually not happened yet. Maybe that's a mark of success for this podcast, is if somebody just is like, "Fuck this."
We haven't really thought about how high we've gone over that mark. We've gone quite a ways over that mark to never trip it up. Have somebody just be like, "I'm out."
But anyway, so tell us about it.
So it's called Lines in the Corner, and it is probably the briefest summary is about it is it started out as sort of a alternative to gun and knife violence in rural Virginia. This guy.
That should be the official subtitle.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty much what
Lions in the Corner, an alternative to gun and knife violence in rural West Virginia.
But it's about a group called Street Beefs, and Street Beefs was started back like probably officially in 2013 by this guy named probably his most popular name is Scarface. His actual name is Chris Wilmore. I call him Chris. I don't think I've ever actually called him Scarface, but a lot of people there call him Scarface, and I've known him. It takes place in a town called Hairston, Virginia, which is in the western side of Virginia, really close to West Virginia. And I met this guy like 10 years ago when I was like weightlifting at this gym, and he's he's an intense looking dude. I mean, he'll admit it. He was in a house fire when he was like 6 or 7, and I believe he told me they suspect it to be gang related, but it might have been an accident. They're not sure. But half of his face is covered in burn scars. And so seeing him, 10 years ago, I was like, man, this guy looks intense. And then in 2016, I learned about this club that he started in 2013, or not a club, a group called Street Beefs. And sort of the reason he started it was, at the time in 2013, he was just losing friends like left and right to gunshot wounds and knife wounds over like really petty stuff, like women or money. And so he basically was like, the way it works now is, he's got 1 million subscribers on YouTube now. He's like blown up. He started uploading these fights at a competitive level, but he also uploads videos of the actual beefs. But the way it started was primarily for he would hear Jim and Joe are fighting over, a girl or money owed or whatever, and be like, guys, I know you both own guns, or I know you both are like, eager to use a knife. I've got this like backyard. I've got like a ref. I can ref. Why don't we just put some MMA gloves on and figure it out? And let's just see if you get some testosterone pumping, if you just get your blood pumping, maybe that'll figure it out. And it sort of blew up into this very successful program, not only in this sort of small town locality that is this part of Virginia, but it's, it went from like statewide to national to international. And when I discovered the story, it was right after the New York Times did a piece on him and the group. And they actually did a doc as well. It was like a 20-minute, it's very journalistic. It's not very cinematic, but it's well done and it explores the concept really well. So I saw that and I was like, how am I not doing this doc? This is in my hometown. I know this guy. Yeah. And so I actually started filming it in 2016, but it took until 2018 to finish filming because the fight days themselves are so big now and so unpredictable. To land a shoot date where we could have all the crew and all the resources with at least like 10 to 15 fights was really hard. I mean, we started for like months before we nailed down a date.
And how many people are in the crew? Like one of the things I find fascinating about this is just how did you guys actually pull this off? I mean, obviously you're there, but how many other people do you have with you?
Oh, like the film crew?
Yeah.
We were pretty targeted. I've been I would say professionally directing at a commercial level for the past like 5 years. Mm-hmm. And I sort of got together some, a cinematographer I was close with, even people that I grew up with that I would make like YouTube shorts as like a teenager. Mm-hmm. I pulled them in to like be a production assistant. Cool. And like, so I think it was really only 4 or 5 people. We had a Steadicam operator, right? Cinematographer, assistant camera, and a PA and me. So it's 5 total.
The one other, I mean, there's a whole lot to talk about within all that realm and stuff, but the one thing that I really found, I mean, I found a lot of it to be compelling. And when you talk about, you just sort of mentioned the difference between this sort of journalistic piece that the New York Times did and the cinematic piece that you did. Maybe we can break that down for people who don't understand what the difference of those two things is. But one of the things that I really loved about your cinematic take on it was that the sound was fucking incredible, man. And like, how did you do the sound? Because I don't know how did you do the sound? Because it blows my mind because it's a big space those guys are fighting in. And man, the sound of those blows hitting, it's a very interesting thing. Because when you in right now in the MMA world, we're seeing some fights take place on television without crowds, and that changes that whole oral experience of it as well. But the sound of guys outside punching each other, it's you very much captured that part of it very well, and I think it's one of the things that really is immersive about that movie. So anyway, so without further ado, let me shut up so you can tell me, how did you get this sound?
I'm really glad that you said that, because actually that was sort of so it also premiered in some European festivals, and it actually went to an Australian festival as well. One of the main comments that they had, and I don't know if this is just an American sensibility, but they're like, the sounds sound so unrealistic. Like the punches sound ridiculous, they sound cartoony. And I was like, that's just because Americans need to hear that violence, Like I don't know what it is, but the way I did it was probably half of that is, we had sounds to track, and that's like we had a boom operator get in and over them. So there's a boom operator hovering, but a lot of that is due to the genius of a sound designer that I worked with in post, named Jeff Strasser at a sound company called Mr. Bronx. And he just, I worked with him for about a week, and I've been working with him since 2015. But that was really the goal, was like, how do we sort of make that juxtaposition of this sort of like really callous violence towards the more emotional elements later on in the film. I really wanted those two to really butt up against each other as much as possible.
Yeah, I think also it's anybody from like a sort of film 101 sort of perspective knows that sound is the most overlooked, underutilized method to get your story and to elevate your film on a completely new level. That's a huge boon to your film, to have really conscious sound design and really thoughtful source material to sort of use for that sound design. I think that when I watched it, and maybe it's just because I know a little bit about what's going on under the hood, just from understanding how things get made a little bit. There was only maybe a couple of moments where I felt like it was a little hyper illustrated, if there was any sort of critique at all. Only a couple of moments where I was actually slightly sort of taken or distracted by it. But for me, that's pretty massive in a good way. Like I wasn't usually technical things and hyper articulated things fully distract me as a person who does filmmaking. So like it all flowed and worked to me. I was wondering too, like it's kind of like, is this sound design, or was this captured, and how was it captured? You could tell that the source, it wasn't like, let's take a bunch of stuff from a sound library and superimpose it. I mean, you could tell that it was, more natural. But I wondered even like, did they have some sort of like a parabolic, or something that was, like sort of hyper shotgunning this sound? But it was really cool. And also, I think that one of the things you do well in the film is rhythm, and the way that you can punctuate beats and parallel beats in filmmaking to paralleling beats in fights, and the sort of escalating sort of tensions that you want in a film, and the escalating tensions that you want to portray in a fight, were very at sort of a parody, or at a point of cooperation that I thought was really cool and sort of seamless. It just all felt good, and even when things got sort of quick, I didn't feel like I was getting like, okay, here comes the editing show, like
right.
It felt like you kind of got brought into it and then sort of brought back out of it in a nice rhythmic and natural way.
That's so good to hear, and I really appreciate that. No, and I agree with you about the sound design, that it can be sort of over illustrative. And I think, for me, that was a bit of a learning experience, because most of my portfolio is sort of antithetical to that piece. I mean, I like most of my personal work and commercial work are very slow, very saccharine, emotional pieces. And it was like, I had never made anything like that. And I remember when I put it out, a lot of people were like, did you make it? Like, is this yours? Are you co-directing this? Is this with someone else? So, and so I completely agree with you. And that for me was an opportunity to sort of learn how to sort of approach, and that was new to me. I grew up, this is sort of an aside, but I grew up Mennonite, which is our notorious pacifistic denomination of Christianity. And fighting to me was just something I never understood, never had any awareness about. So those probably overly like illustrative sound effects are because I've never been in a fight. The first time I've really ever watched a fight was that project. So, you know, to me, I was like, oh, this is how it sounds all the time. Like, this is what Rocky sounded like. You know, like I just, it was probably my unfamiliarity, or yeah, I just wasn't familiar with what, you know, fights actually sound like. But it was a good opportunity because I love pacing. I'm really obsessed with pacing to, like you said, sort of punctuate that rhythm and give the story arc some chapter markers.
Man.
Yeah, I think you did a nice job with that, and I think, and you know, did a great job as well of, you know, the really the deeper story of the movie is really the story about Scarface and about, you know, like you said, this fact that he had been in this, you know, basically has had a very tough life, obviously came up in a tough situation, found himself in jail at a young age, got out of jail, met a woman, has had a couple of children, and is basically trying to live a decent life for himself, but is constantly challenged also by the fact that he's a convicted felon. And there's, you know, unfortunately in our society, like, we all but write those people off and then still expect them to be exemplary citizens somehow.
Yeah.
You know, so he's struggling with those things. And then this Beefs Club is like all like you know, sort of like his way of finding a thing that he can do that's, you know, a business he can run and a service he can offer, and really, and it's really insights that only somebody like him could have, that like, hey, something like this could work. Most other people wouldn't think, hey, we'll just put guys in a fight in the backyard and it'll actually have this real positive social effect.
Right. No, I don't even think, I think, you know, to start for him, he was like, how do I stop my friends from dying? Yeah. And, you know, I think he, you know, was in a gang that's mentioned in the film. And he, you know, the reason, you know, he also has this sort of hoarse voice. It's covered in the film because he was just straight stabbed in the throat in a bar fight and, like, you know, was lying on the ground bleeding to death. So he knows what it's like, you know, to escalate. I think he's been in any number of, and he was like involved in a prescription drug ring, and so he's like been around the block. And I think, you know, to start, and I think it sort of surprised him from, I mean, he would probably be able to speak on this better than me, but it surprised him from its sort of culmination 2012 2013 to 2016 when the New York Times came in, because once he started uploading these fights to YouTube, and then people started coming not because they wanted to solve a beef, but just because they wanted to fight. So I would say now the group, you know, it's like I said, it's exploded in popularity. I definitely came into it and published this film sort of late in the game. If I had published it like 4 years ago, it'd probably be a little bit more true to how I portrayed it. But now it is for sure an online sensation. I've been in New York and Brooklyn, and, like, you know, I've literally seen, I'm not even kidding, I've literally seen Uber drivers with a Street Beefs video pulled up on their, like, phone just because they have, like, you know, 1 million subscribers. So now I'd say, like, most of the fights there are like 80, 75% sport, 15. So now it's like the beef element is like sort of like, oh yeah, we still do that, but, you know, it's secondary now.
But like a you know, an amateur boxing club, that you know, those also fulfill that same need for these younger kids, especially, or you know, even you know, older people or whatever, to be in a situation where it's like, hey, you know, if you're here learning how to box or learning how to be an MMA, you know, fighter, you're not out on the streets getting in trouble, you know, and or if you are out in the streets getting in trouble, why don't you come here and show how bad you are instead of killing each other out there? One of the 100%. things you show in the movie too, which I think is cool, and I think a lot of times in like the MMA world or in the boxing world or whatever, it can seem like it's all a bit more put on maybe, or a bit more just traditional for two people who've seemed to have had a lot of enmity for each other to, at the end of a fight, you know, look each other in the eye and obviously respect each other very much and even have an affection for one another. But I think in your movie, it really goes a long way to showing, no, that's actually real. That really happens between people, and two people who, you know, like in a situation with gangs, especially or something like that, it comes down to like a whole thing of like, I have to be respected, you know what I mean? For all these reasons. And it might not even be that I even hate you that much or that I even want to hurt you that bad, but I'm in a position where I have to do this because I live in a hierarchy and I don't want to lose my spot, and this is expected of me and who knows what, you know? So I think a lot of times in your video, you show how, you know, two people like that who might be representatives of whole groups that are at each other's throats, like it actually works where these guys actually go ahead and pound on each other. And at the end of it, it's good. And everybody walks away and everybody can hold their heads up high and say, hey, that's got settled, that's all done. We're done with that now. It actually works. And that's really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, for me, like, it's so interesting that you've covered like that and the felon stuff. There's so many elements to this, and I wasn't really sure how to focus it. For me, like, the biggest thing was that like, even though it's turned into this sporting thing, it's the community. Like, these people are training twice a week. People are driving in like 2 or 3 hours just to be a part of this community. And often a lot of these people are ex-drug addicts. A lot of these people were hooked on opioids, alcoholics. And if they're not addicted to something or formerly addicted to something, they're felons, and they can't, a lot of these people just can't get jobs. And so, instead of doing God knows what out there, they're coming to this this devoted community that meets, twice a week and then has these events once a month. You hit it right on the head there. It's like, it's not only this preventative, thing for gun and knife violence. It's this sort of emotional support group for, I think, a group of people that don't really know how to communicate to each other with an emotional clarity, if that makes sense. Like,
yeah.
And that to me was like, you see this group on the surface and you're like, any, Joe or Jane on the street would say, oh, this is just a bunch of shirtless dudes in the county, like beating the piss out of each other. But there is this like deep rooted emotionality to like why they do it and why they keep coming back, and the sort of community that is subtly fostered with this. And they have like a Facebook group, and they're giving people like rides from like Ohio and even California, and like putting people up. I mean, it really shocked me, and it's very surreal to see these just like, like face tatted to toe, just like ripped dudes just being like, I love you, man. Like, just like, hugging each other. And it's really interesting.
What was it like for you? I'll say this, I'll preface the question with this. I think for any of us that are combat sports fans, we've all been in a spot where you have to sort of reconcile, the realities of what's going on. And it can be hard, at times, depending on the outcomes, sometimes, or how bloody the fight is, or whatever. It can be hard sometimes, or to sort of justify it, or you kind of wrestle with yourself about it. And I think a lot of people that we talk to that are writers and creatives in other realms associated to combat sports, I think a lot of us are people that are essentially magnetized to stories and concentrated narratives and power and impact and visual beauty and in whatever realm. And so there's just something about the compression of the human experience that is what fighting is, that it's this primordial thing that we're all magnetized towards, and it just is, and we have to sort of work to reconcile that. Did you find yourself coming from sort of a Mennonite upbringing, and to being sort of up close and personal with it? What was that sort of walk like for you? Were there certain things where immediately maybe you felt you didn't want to portray as much in the film, or that you wanted to perhaps maybe soften, whereas maybe in other ways you realized after you've even just been there for a shoot or two, you kind of acclimated? Like, how did that work for you?
That's a really great question. It was definitely, this sounds like the most pretentious thing a filmmaker can say, but it was a highly introspective experience for me, because like, if you would have asked me 5 years ago, is there a role for violence? I would have said flat out, absolutely not. No, like, we as a society and as a species have evolved beyond that. We've developed beyond that. Violence is this superfluous, like, sort of vestigial element of our existence that we shouldn't. But looking at this, I think that it has taught me that there is nuance to the human experience that is so deep and so layered for, not only like sort of your upbringing and like, what you've learned to value, whether that, how you communicate, right? So like, I'm not saying all these people don't know how to talk to each other and they're just like Neanderthals. There are plenty of wildly intelligent people that I've met in street beefs and, really amazing human beings. But it is just a fundamentally different upbringing than what I had. And I think that sort of what I learned through this experience, and as a doc director in general, I've sort of pushed myself to feel this way more often than not, is where is the empathy that I don't understand, right? And so the first couple shoots was really digging deep in myself and my ideology to extend an empathy for why this makes sense. And I still have never been in a fight. I still don't, I don't do any sort of, even vaguely fight related, cardio or anything. But it has fundamentally changed my perspective on the role of things like MMA and boxing and everything, which I used to see as barbaric. And I actually see them now as exactly like you just put it, a fundamental part of our biology. And I think a fundamental part that, it's made me measure violence in an end result. Would you rather have someone, sweat it out, maybe get a couple bruises, a dinged up cheekbone with some gloves and like get all that energy out? It's technically violence. Or would you rather have someone with a bullet hole or a knife wound? And like when you start examining, and not to say that that's like how you should measure, competitive sporting is not measured in that, way, but
not including like CTE or right.
Yeah, exactly. But like it made me really analyze why people like it. And as I sort of watched the fights unfold, I got into it too. And I think there is like just a connectivity of two people fighting and witnessing that sort of give and take of power that is just innately human. And I think, I will always, from here on out, see fighting as just a fundamentally human thing.
Yeah, Joe.
I think, one of the things that makes me, question like the things you're talking about right now is like you sort of couched all this in the context of, being a documentary filmmaker. Are you a documentary filmmaker because you specifically want to be a documentary filmmaker, or are you a documentary filmmaker because that's been the kind of movie you've had the opportunity to make so far? Like, what's your relationship to documentary film?
No, that's a good question. Probably even like a year ago, 2 years ago, I would have told you, oh, this is just a stepping stone for narrative work. Like, I want to be doing, I want to be the next Chris Nolan or whatever, but at this point, I have had so many phenomenally fulfilling experiences with doc filmmaking. And the more I get into it and the more I sort of like learn and like hone and my I guess skill set and experiment with stuff. And I've only been doing this a really short amount of time. I have so much left to learn, and hopefully I will get into narrative. But for right now, I sort of see myself staying in the doc world. My next projects are going to be docs. Commercially, I'm most consistently hired for documentary work, or at least real people involved. And yeah, I don't know. In my opinion, it's the best job in the world. Pre-coronavirus, I was traveling, 10, 11 places a year, meeting different people and just diving into the stories. And it's just fun. So I really enjoy it.
Mm-hmm. We talked a little bit about the fact that you, I think this was before we got on the air, you were talking about the fact that you had flown to Australia in April, was it?
January to March.
January to March. That's right. Yeah, January to March. And then you were coming back into New York basically at the worst time possible, right at the beginning of March. And then you just recently got out of there to be in Virginia now. Is that right?
Yeah, I was flying in probably a week after the first case in New York was reported. Like March 1st was the first case. So it was like I watched numbers go 1, 30, 100, and like when I was flying in, it was like several hundred, and like they were saying there's Tom Hanks had coronavirus in Australia. They're just like breathing the same air as everyone on this flight, and I just remember like anytime I'd hear someone cough, I would just like tense up. But yeah, it was when I landed, I had this like sore throat. I was convinced for a week that I had it. But I was essentially trapped. That sounds dramatic. I was lucky enough that I had money and resources that I didn't need to go out and work every day. And I wasn't furloughed or anything, but I was inside my apartment for at one point 3 weeks, and my roommate was gone, so I didn't see a single human for 3 weeks. Didn't deliver anything, just bought like a ton of groceries and just like lived off of that for 3 weeks, because it was terrifying for late March into early April. It was
especially in New York.
Yeah, epicenter.
So like for instance, like I'm working on a doc next week. I'm just doing the drone op work for it, and I'm working with this production company out of LA, and I had to tell them. I said, look, the only way I can go to all these locations throughout the South to do all this shooting that you need.
Oh,
I just said I need an RV.
Yeah.
Because, like I'm not gonna go and just like stay at a hotel, Airbnb, and just kind of pretend like things are okay. Did my research and I was just like, no. Especially when you're out in the field and you're, shooting in places. If you're just doing the drone work, it's not like you're on a permitted site with all these PAs and all this stuff. It's like you're just kind of out there after maybe the main stuff's already been shot, a month before or whatever, and they've just kind of given you a list of some things they really want, and you're out there just sort of getting it. But I'm gonna have to go shoot, basically next week, living out of an RV for about a week across Kentucky and Tennessee and South Carolina, which I'm happy to do. Right? I mean,
Yeah.
But I just realized once faced with a job in this environment that required that much travel and what was going to be happening, I was like, this is kind of the only way that I'll do it, that I feel safe. So I guess my question to you is like, how are you doing right now, and how are you moving forward with projects that you have, and how is that looking in terms of the climate right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think all of obviously Hollywood, but also the commercial sphere and the branded content sphere, everyone's confused. No one knows what to do. I've been lucky enough that I've been doing a lot of user-generated content where I'm remotely directing people to shoot themselves, and we sort of dead drop media, and we're able to sanitize the equipment and the cards and whatever. But yeah, physical shoots are sort of an enigma right now, and sort of a Pandora's box of like, we have no idea what that's going to look like. And personally, the idea of shooting docs, I mean, a month ago, I was like, oh, this is great. The whole country's sort of like getting a grip on things. And like, lo and behold, we aren't. So, the cases are rising. And I don't know. That's a really good question. At this point, I have a physical shoot at the end of this month in Colorado that I'm bidding on right now. I haven't won it. But like, if I do win it, I'm not going to fly there. I'm likely going to drive.
Yeah.
And I think we have like a crew of like 4 people, and we all wear masks, and we have to stand 6 feet away from each other and communicate over radios. And that'll be the first physical shoot that I will do.
Yeah.
And I wish I could ask for an RV, but you make a great point, because it's sort of it's a no man's land no matter where you go.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to have to like go into random places to use random bathrooms or whatever when you're just out in the field. Like, I want a self-contained, I want a generator, I want a shower, I want the whole thing. And it's actually not crazy expensive when you put it all together. The best deals I've found are like if you do like an RV Sprinter style, because they actually get really good gas mileage. But the availability of stuff right now is tricky because it's summer and everybody's flipping out and kind of doing something similar. So it's a weird thing when I'm looking at like, $80,000 RV Sprinters. I'm like, maybe that's an investment that we should just make right now. Like, we'll have it. But not that I can't afford that, but it's funny, like the instantly new things that you've never really considered before. Now, like, maybe that's going to be the thing.
Thunderdome food truck.
But yeah, so I mean, I think that, also it's, even from like a DP sort of perspective, right? You're going to be like, I don't know, are we going to use the 200 millimeter or the 300 millimeter for this?
Yeah. Telling your DP, sorry, we're only doing telephoto work from now on. So if you could use that'd be great. No, I actually remember I did this big job in October of last year. It was like a month-long job. And I was like so exhausted at the end of it. I was like, you know what? Maybe I'll just sublet my apartment and get like a trailer, and just like, because I know DPs who like pre-corona, like just live on like a plot of land that they rent for $100 a month, and then they just drive their trailer wherever they want. I think it's called like, there's a name for it, RV life, trailer life, whatever that is.
Van life, bro. Van life.
Yeah, van life. Yeah, there it is.
Yeah. It's like a weird interstitial of reality between the way that most people live and what is actually Instagram.
Yeah. Well, I got really deep in the van life YouTube community, and like for like a week there, I was like, my algorithm was all van life stuff for a week.
Yeah.
And I was like, like 5 worst things about living in a van with your significant other, and it's like like the bathroom is the worst part. Like a lot of the times it's just like you're like riding with your waste wherever you go, and the smell is awful, and just putting that out. So it's like, I do like indoor plumbing, I guess, don't I? That's nice.
Yeah, you can't. There's no way to document smell through Instagram, so nobody can tell. Nobody can tell how dehumanizing it actually is. No, I mean, ultimately, like proximity to anyone you care about, you need to weigh out very carefully. You know, my wife and I have even thought about this for this, you know, because she'll come with me on this gig because she's sort of my visual observer and helps me with not hurting myself or other people when flying a giant lawnmower camera in the sky. But you know, we were talking about it, like in our house, you know, like I have my own studio, she's got her own office. We're very lucky, very fortunate to be in this position, and this is how we've been able to stay home most of the time, if not all the time, for the last 4 months and not go completely batshit crazy. Yeah. But now we're gonna put ourselves in an RV. We'll see how this goes, you know.
Oh, so you're going together? Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So, should I be scared?
No, gosh, I don't know. I've lived with a significant other only once in a fully furnished apartment, and it was fine. So I have no idea what it's like to be in an even more confined space.
We'll do fine. We'll do fine. But it is interesting just to see about like, you know, we've talked about this with a few other guests for sure, but it's like, it's really important right now to see opportunity as much as you're seeing limitation, because there's so many weird circumstances that are creating new potentials, and you have to sort of evaluate those on a level that is different than maybe the way you would typically evaluate ideas or plans or thoughts that you would want to have about a project, because when you're forced into sort of ideating or creating new shit, it's cool, but it's like, is this only cool because for like 2 weeks, or is this something that will actually sort of survive or transcend the absolute weird dynamic nature of everything that's going on? You know, it's a strange new criteria for the evaluation of ideas and projects.
Yeah, I'm biased in saying this, you know, literally because I've done like 6 user-generated content projects since like late March. But I think that people were saying that in the next decade of at least, you know, online content, I don't know how much of this is going to lead, and I'm mainly talking about the commercial sphere right now, that we're going to see just an enormous rise in user-generated content. It's going to become progressively cheaper. The Instagrams and the Twitter users and the Snapchatters, you know, I sound so old saying that, but like they you know, that's the way, you know, we're getting used to seeing the world, and content is good. And if you look even in like, you know, I have some really talented friends who do music videos for like Billie Eilish and stuff, and like half the stuff there and half the stuff for the more modern like Nike and Adidas campaigns are these sort of user-generated aesthetics, and they just, you know, and in my opinion, I think especially with coronavirus, but in general, we're going to see this shift towards consumer-oriented media. And we'll always have a role for like polished spots. I think those will always, but they'll be less prevalent than the stuff we're seeing now.
Yeah, it's similar to like what happened with music, you know, in the sort of transformation period that music studios went through, going from analog to digital back in the day, where you know, people had to realize that the stuff that it was just getting easier and easier for people to do at home and get nearly the same quality, and if it didn't have the same quality, it still had a quality that became the new sort of moniker or language or reference point for what is, you know, ostensibly the times, you know. But I think that's going to work a couple different ways. I mean, I have this. I mentioned this I think before, but it's like even like as we're on this show right now, you know, and we're all in these little boxes with our headphones. You know, I feel like I think that's going to become in time like the aesthetic that people don't want. The Zoom call aesthetic, let's just call it that, right? Charming at first, but now I think people I think associate that with anxiety and with distance and with stress, and I think that time will tell how that specific visual set of aesthetics or cues sort of whatever that prompts for people emotionally, or if it's like you just never know if it's going to be something that's like kind of nostalgic and interesting, even though it's lesser, or if it's something where it's like, yeah, I don't even want to see that shit, man. Like, you know, lived there, been there, done that. I don't want to see it anymore.
It's anxiety inducing. Zoom calls, Skype calls. I mean, it's like I forget what article I read. I sound like I'm on Joe Rogan right now. We're like, pull it up, Jamie. But they
we have
they
the
read
documents.
this article that was like the reason that we sort of get disconcerted and uncomfortable and like sort of anxiety induced on these calls is because it's unnatural, the delay. Like this little delay is just wholly unnatural. To see someone's face and to have a group of people, it is, our brains weren't wired to communicate with this sort of latency.
It really is. Latency is the killer.
Yeah.
Like it was just even in that moment right there, because I just cut off Joe.
Yeah.
And then now
latency.
I'm
gonna come up with a new composition. It's called latency. Latency. It's gonna be 4 parts. Latency 1, latency 2. No, I think that's true. I mean, I actually just the other day something came up in an email where someone was suggesting, some stuff and blah blah blah, and maybe we should all get together on a Zoom call. And I was like, man, maybe the day of you can ask me again if I want to, but right now, if you're asking me to plan to have a Zoom call with everybody voluntarily, I just don't really feel like I'm going to want to do that. The podcast is different. And in a way, I feel like the aesthetics of the podcast are different. I mean, Brian and I are clearly professionals with microphones and headsets.
Yeah.
So
sound a lot better than I do. Yeah.
It's a little different. No, but even you have your head, you're not just somebody in their kitchen talking into their phone in this like casual way that in the back of my mind is just going trauma.
Right. Yeah.
The world is on its on its edge, you know what I mean? So I feel like it's and when I see a lot of the commercials and things like that are like specifically just that aesthetic in commercials and stuff, and not specifically the user created kind of thing you were talking about, but like literally the Zoom phone aesthetic in this commercial, and we're all in this together, whatever. I'm just like, oh my God, it makes me, it's worse than just showing me. Just show me some weird fantasy.
Yeah, that we can all still hang out. No, that's so funny.
Weird fantasy.
Yeah. No, I mean, I totally agree. And I think like the best advertising right now aren't the sort of hollow, like we're all in this together, we stand by you during this crisis. It's like exploring the narratives of what it looks like and why it sucks, like right now, and like, how certain families and certain social dynamics are getting through. And to me, I really probably only mean that from like a familial perspective. Like I feel like we're, and a lot of the stuff that I work on is like, what it looks like to raise kids right now, and what it looks like to, be at home way more with them than you usually are.
Right.
I've heard from older friends of mine, that have kids that are in the double digits, that it has fundamentally changed their relationship with their kids, which was so interesting to me, that just like, you sort of forget how much time you hypothetically can spend with your children until you're forced to do it. And I think sort of having human insight into those types of experiences, I know this sounds so sociopathic, is the best type of advertising to like relate to people, like, that like, this sucks, but here's the little ray of light.
This is gold.
We'll get through together.
This is
gold. This is
no one can resist it.
Well, to sort of loop it back around to the film in a way, because one of the things I think is interesting too, in terms of the flavor of the times, or what people tend to magnetize towards, or maybe what people are maybe having a harder time digesting, is sort of this notion of the sort of the anti-hero as the protagonist versus sort of the hero as the protagonist. And the conventional hero as the protagonist, I think, at this point is really not connecting, because it seems disconnected from reality. I think that people seeing flaws and challenge, and people wrestling with themselves as they wrestle with something larger than themselves, that they're trying to be their best selves to conquer a problem or to get through something. I think that the anti-hero is far more appealing right now. And I think that even though I know that your film was sort of, in your mind, kind of on a delay, and sort of captured something a little bit later than its most robust time and all of that, still the story of Scarface, or Mr. Face or Chris, I will call him Sir. No, but I think that his story is so timeless, and he is I think a great example of a sort of from a societal point of view, not my point of view, but sort of the larger point of view, a felon, right? He's a kind of an anti-hero, right? In by definition. And I think that's really, there's a lot of warmth that surrounds, I think, that kind of, for lack of a better term, character right now.
Yeah, I really appreciate hearing that, because, you know, I'll say this about Chris. He is easily one of the most sincere and just like, it's funny you say that. I would equate him to probably the closest thing to a real, you know, hero that I've ever sort of encountered in the doc world. But no, you make a great point, because it's so funny you say that. I just finished rewatching The Sopranos and Breaking Bad, which sort of were this, like, I would say, trailblazers in the world of television for the anti-hero. And it does make you question why those shows are so popular, and why someone like Scarface is such an alluring person to document, because his flaws are on his face. You know, like he was raised in an environment that, you know, thrust him into a world of crime, and that eventually ended up with him being a felon. And, you know, like, that's what I thought was so interesting about his character, is that he sort of made his mistakes, owns up to them very earnestly, and tries to help people not only younger than him, but even people his age, avoid making those same mistakes. And people who have already made those mistakes, giving them a community and giving them a place of respite where they're understood and they're given a sincerity that they otherwise normally wouldn't be able to find. So no, that was something, and I feel like I so often, you know, in my documentary projects, try to find the most pure, the most emotionally, like, transparent. This was a hard one, because as most of my portfolio is just these, like, probably, you know, overtly emotional narratives, and this one was like, okay, this is a challenging thing to find, you know, what the morality of the situation is, and, like, why what he is doing is clearly good, for the good. And as I got more involved in it, it became so easy to do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, it definitely is like a moving movie, a human movie, and I think a movie that sort of along the lines of what we kind of try to do when we're trying to juxtapose, you know, things like combat sports or martial arts against things like fine art and things like this that are, you know, things that are considered ugly by some people and things that are considered beautiful by other people, and trying to show people that there's this overlap between us. And to me, like, the story part of your movie and the character part of your movie do such a great job of telling that whole human story about this guy and all these people in this situation. But the art side of your movie and the deep, like, cinema of it are as much a reason to watch your movie as to get to know Scarface and to find out more about this story. So if our listeners want to, you know, check out the film for themselves, where should they go? And then we'll get to wherever they can find you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So if you just Google Lions in the Corner, you're probably going to come across you're going to come across 3 links.
Okay.
It's online for free on my Vimeo, on the Street Beefs YouTube, and on my cinematographer Gal Parat's Vimeo. So there are 3 places you can watch it right now for free.
All right. Killer. And what is your name on Twitter? And what platforms are you most active on?
Probably Instagram.
Okay.
But yeah, my Twitter is pretty facetious. But it's my Instagram is.
That's where I found you.
Yeah, I know. It's not
that was your first impression. It was a good first impression.
That's good. It's just a bunch of, like, memes about millennials. I mean, but anyway, my Instagram is just my first and last name. So Paul Hairston, all one word.
Hairston.
Yep.
Cool.
Right on.
Well, thanks so much, Paul. We'll make sure that all the information and the links and everything are all in the show notes for everybody. So if you're just listening on audio, you look in the show description, you'll have things you can click to get to the film in there. And if you guys are watching live or after live, it'll be in the description below, as the kids always say. But anyway, so you know, is there anything else you feel like you want to? Is there something upcoming or anything that you want to sort of shout out or anything before we head out?
I would tell everyone listening to check out Art Fight podcast for sure.
Right on. Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. I was really happy to find you. Like I said, someone shared your movie on Twitter, and I was just like, bing, bing, bing. I'm like, this
I'm
looks interesting. And then I was like, who's this guy? And then I'm like, where's that movie? And then I got to it,
Yeah.
and I definitely was excited to see it, and glad that you were so willing to, respond and to get in touch and to get on our schedule so we could have this chat with you today.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I really appreciate it, and it's been a blast. Thanks so much for having me on.
All right, so
Hopefully we can actually meet each other in real life at some point, somewhere out
God
on the
willing.
road in our sprinters.
Yeah.
Sprinter
Van life.
gang. So, all right, well, so hang loose, Paul. We'll talk to you more after we cut out of the live stream here, but I'm going to go ahead and run to our end sequence. Thanks, everybody, for listening and being a part of it, and go find Paul's shit.
Peace.
Go find Paul's work because it's real good. Take care, everybody.